It's the winter of 100 CE, and you're 3 floors up in an insula in Rome's Suburra district, jamming a strip of old cloth into the gap under a wooden shutter to choke off the last draft of cold air. In your other hand is a thick, doubled length of raw wool, the blanket you're about to wrap around your shoulders the second you sit down. On the floor beside you, a bronze brazier is already glowing, stacked with charcoal, throwing off enough heat to fog the one small window you haven't sealed yet. There's no chimney in this room, no vent, no flue, nothing built into these walls to let smoke or fumes out once every gap is shut against the cold. You've already bolted the door. Outside, it's already past 5°C below freezing and still dropping. Your head is starting to feel heavy, and you're telling yourself it's just the warmth. Finally, after a cold day. Here's the thing everyone assumes about Roman heating, and it's wrong. The missing chimney wasn't a design flaw nobody caught. It was the arrangement itself, chosen on purpose, because a cold room felt like the more urgent threat than whatever the fire might be doing to the air. And that math didn't retire with the empire. You've made the same trade this week if you've ever shut every window before bed to hold in the heat from a space heater or a gas stove without once checking what was actually building up in the room while you slept. Seal the room, trust the fire, skip the air. Rome ran that exact decision for roughly 4 centuries across a city of somewhere around 1 million people, and we never actually retired it. We just changed the fuel. So today, we're going through all of it, piece by piece, the way it actually sat in that sealed room, the bronze brazier itself, and the fuel it burned, the doubled wool blanket, and what it could and couldn't protect you from, the bolted door and shuttered window, with nowhere for the smoke to go once they were closed, the Hippocaust heating only the rich ever got near, and a philosopher's own letter naming exactly who got left out of that luxury. The strange, specific smell ancient doctors kept warning people about that almost nobody listened to, and the well-documented night an emperor went to sleep in a freshly plastered room, sealed up warm, and simply never woke up. By the end, you're going to understand exactly why sealing a room against the cold has never once been free in any century. Let's go. So how do we actually know any of this? The brazier, the sealed room, the specific danger sitting inside it. Start with the walls themselves. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, buried in a single afternoon by Vesuvius in 79 CE, archaeologists have documented soot blackening across ceilings and interior walls in room after room, the physical residue of exactly this kind of indoor burning, preserved because nothing ever came after to scrape it off or repaint over it. Add to that a 2025 material culture study published in the journal Adalia, cataloging the braziers themselves in detail. Terracotta and bronze basins, short legs, a ring of draft holes cut into the base to keep the charcoal breathing. That's the object, confirmed. And there's one specific room on one specific night where we actually know a name, a date, and a cause of death that historians still argue about 16 centuries later. We'll get to him. Here's what most people assume when they picture a Roman burning charcoal indoors with the door shut. The danger they're picturing is fire, the building catching, the insula going up floor by floor, the thing every Roman genuinely worried about, in law, in poetry, in policy. And that assumption isn't unreasonable. Rome capped building height specifically over fire risk, and its night watch, the vigiles, existed mainly to fight exactly that. So it's easy to assume that if a room didn't burn down, the people sleeping inside it were fine by morning. Nobody pictures the air itself as the killer. Nobody pictures a fire that behaves perfectly, produces no flame anywhere near a wall, burns exactly as intended all night long, and still empties the room of everyone breathing in it by sunrise. Here's the part that breaks that assumption. Charcoal was the preferred brazier fuel, specifically because it burns hotter and with far less visible smoke than raw wood, a property the 2025 Adalia study confirms Romans understood and actively selected for. Less visible smoke reads as safer. It isn't. Burning charcoal in a room with limited air produces carbon monoxide, a gas with no color and no smell, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's own mortality data, published in 2013, counted 5,149 American deaths between 1999 and 2010 from that exact mechanism alone. Unintentional non-fire carbon monoxide poisoning, nothing burning, no flames near a single wall, an average of 430 people a year in a country with smoke detectors, building codes, and a CO alarm sold at every hardware store. Rome had none of that. Rome had a bronze bowl and a bolted door. Start with the object itself, because it's stranger and more deliberate than it looks. A Roman brazier was a shallow basin, bronze if you had money, plain-fired terracotta if you didn't, sitting on 3 or 4 short legs with a ring of small holes punched around the base. For a long time, nobody could say with any confidence how carefully that basin had actually been engineered, because bronze examples were almost never allowed to survive. Bronze was valuable. When a brazier cracked or went out of fashion, it went back into the furnace and became something else entirely. A pot, a coin, a hinge. Terracotta ones, meanwhile, just crumbled. So archaeologists were left arguing over whether the whole design was crude and improvised, or genuinely thought through, right up until a 2025 excavation study out of Fakaya on the Aegean coast of modern Turkey cataloged a set of terracotta and bronze braziers well preserved enough to still show their draft holes and their ash lines intact. Published by researcher Nur Uguz in the journal Adalia, issue 28. The study did something simple and decisive. It matched the pattern of soot and ash residue inside each basin to the position of its draft holes. And the pattern wasn't random. It proved the holes were placed and sized to starve the fire just enough, keeping the coals at a slow, glowing burn instead of an open flame. That's a real design choice, not an accident, and it's the same choice that lets a Roman brazier hold a bed of charcoal at somewhere close to 700 degrees C, which is about 1/300 F, for hours on a single load, radiating heat without ever needing feeding, refueling, or a chimney to breathe through. Here's why that specific choice matters more than it sounds like it should. A fire that gets plenty of oxygen burns its fuel almost completely and produces mostly carbon dioxide, which your body handles fine in small amounts. A fire that's deliberately starved of oxygen, exactly the state those draft holes were tuned to hold, burns incompletely and produces carbon monoxide instead. Carbon monoxide has no color and no smell, and it binds to the hemoglobin in your blood roughly 200 to 250 times more readily than oxygen does, according to toxicology data compiled by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. It doesn't just crowd oxygen out, it shoves it aside and takes its seat. So, the exact engineering that made a Roman brazier efficient, smokeless, and pleasant to sit next to is the same engineering that made it, under the wrong conditions, capable of quietly emptying a sealed room of everyone breathing in it. Now step out of the room for a second, because this is the part the thumbnail is actually about, and it's worse than a rate. It's an absence. In roughly 1,000 years of surviving Roman writing, letters, medical texts, court records, funerary inscriptions, there is exactly one death from this specific cause that comes down to us with a name, a date, and a sealed room attached to it. February 17th, 364 CE. That's not because it only happened once. It's because nobody was counting. There was no autopsy, no coroner, no diagnosis for a death that looks, from the outside, exactly like someone who simply didn't wake up. Now the modern number, because we do count now. In 2022, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control's own provisional data recorded 624 accidental carbon monoxide deaths in the United States alone, the highest annual total on record since at least 1999, up 85.7% from a decade earlier. 2,000 years, and the room got safer. The habit inside it didn't. You still shut the gaps and trust the fire. The second thing worth understanding is that Rome absolutely had a version of central heating, and almost nobody who needed it actually got to use it. It's called a hypocaust, a raised floor sitting on short brick or stone pillars, with a furnace at one end pushing hot air underneath the entire room and sometimes up through pipes set into the walls. No brazier, no charcoal indoors, no sealed room full of anything. It shows up constantly in documentaries and reconstructions, enough that people assume it was just how Roman houses worked. It wasn't. Building and running a hypocaust meant a permanent furnace, a slave stoking it for hours on end, and a design integrated into the house from the foundation up, which meant money, land, and staff that the overwhelming majority of Rome's population, packed into rented rooms in 6-story insulae, simply did not have. We don't have to guess at how Romans themselves felt about that gap, because one of them wrote it down. The philosopher Seneca, in a letter to his friend Lucilius written around 65 CE, describes wall heating systems, pipes let into the walls of a bathhouse to spread warmth evenly, and calls the whole idea of that kind of comfort a device invented by, in his own words, the lowest grade of slave. He meant it as a jab at Roman luxury. What it actually documents, whether he intended it or not, is that heated walls existed, worked, and were understood as a mark of wealth, specifically because most people never got near one. So picture the real math of a Roman winter. Somewhere in the same city, on the same cold night, one household has warm walls and clean air, and another has a bronze bowl of coals and a bolted door. And the second household is the one that was never going to end up in the history books unless something went wrong enough to get written down. That's the surprise underneath this whole block. What made a Roman room dangerous wasn't ignorance of a better way. Rome had the better way. It just wasn't yours. Here's the genuinely strange part, and it's not what you'd expect. Ancient Romans didn't have a word for carbon monoxide, obviously, but they also didn't clearly separate it from other invisible household dangers. Medical and historical writers from this period lumped together anything you couldn't see that made a room dangerous to sleep in. Smoke, damp, the sharp smell of fresh plaster, whatever was bad about the air, into one vague catch-all category. When someone died overnight in a closed room in winter, the explanation offered at the time was rarely specific. It was just the air. And that habit of grouping invisible dangers together instead of separating them shows up in the most detailed case on record, where ancient sources argue about whether the room itself, freshly replastered, or the glowing brazier inside it, was actually to blame. We can do something the Romans couldn't. Separate those causes with actual chemistry. 20th and 21st century toxicology gave us a precise, testable definition of carbon monoxide poisoning, and it comes with a recognizable pattern. Drowsiness that gets mistaken for ordinary tiredness, a headache that doesn't lift, then unconsciousness, all inside a sealed, heated room, almost always in the cold months. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission's own data shows that 84% of accidental carbon monoxide deaths tied to home heating equipment happen between September and April, the exact window every single year when people are doing the exact thing you did in that insula, closing every gap to hold in the heat. Apply that pattern backward onto the ancient record, and cases Roman writers filed under bad air or died in his sleep start reading less like a mystery and more like a diagnosis with 16 centuries of paperwork missing. None of that is meant to be shocking for its own sake. It's just what the evidence does once you're allowed to be specific about it. And there's exactly one case in the entire Roman record detailed enough to run that diagnosis on. A name, a date, a room, and a debate among the people who wrote it down that's still going 16 centuries later. That's next. The record comes from a Roman military officer turned historian named Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in Latin from Rome sometime in the 380s or 390s CE, decades after the events he's describing. His account of the year 364 CE survives today mainly through a single medieval manuscript, a 9th century parchment codex known as the Codex Fuldensis, copied at the monastery of Fulda, in what's now Germany, from an older, now lost original. In it, Ammianus tells us that the Emperor Jovian, only 33 years old and 7 months into his reign, was traveling through Dadistana, a small town on the road between Ankara and Nicaea, in what's now Turkey, in the depths of winter. On the night of February 17th, 364 CE, he retired to a bedroom that had just been freshly plastered, with a brazier burning inside it to cut the cold and the damp. In the morning, he was dead. Ammianus doesn't hand us a clean answer, and that's the honest, frustrating part. He records competing explanations circulating at the time, that the charcoal fumes from the brazier had done it, or that the sharp smell of the wet plaster on the freshly finished walls had combined with the smoke and overwhelmed him in his sleep. He also notes, almost in passing, that nobody investigated the death with any real rigor, which for a reigning emperor is its own small scandal. Modern historians reading that account with a toxicologist's eye tend to favor the brazier. Wet plaster is unpleasant, but it isn't reliably lethal in one closed night, the way a bed of unvented charcoal is. Either way, the room did what the room was built to do. It kept the cold out completely, and it kept everything else in just as completely. Here's where I have to be honest with you, because this channel does not fake certainty, and this topic has a specific real limit to it. We do not have a single body count for ordinary Romans who died this way. None. There was no coroner, no registry, no reason for a landlord or a family to write down that someone in a rented room didn't wake up in January. Everything you've just heard about scale is inference, built from three separate things. The chemistry of how a starved oxygen charcoal fire behaves, the fact that the vast majority of the city had no alternative to that fire, and one aristocratic death detailed enough to examine. Even that one case isn't fully settled. Some ancient and modern accounts float other explanations entirely, an overindulgence in mushrooms among them, alongside the fumes. The uncertainty is real. It just doesn't erase the pattern underneath it. The room, the fire, the sealed door, those aren't in dispute. Only the exact head count is. So go back to that room. Third floor, insula, sabura, winter, the shutter gap stuffed with cloth, the brazier glowing on the floor, the wool blanket in your hands. You bolted the door because the cold outside was the danger you understood. Remember the case we promised you at the start, the one where historians still argue about the exact cause, the brazier or the fresh plaster. Here's the twist underneath that argument. It doesn't actually matter which one it was, because both explanations point at the same decision. Somebody sealed a room to keep the warmth in, on purpose, without a way for anything bad to leave. The debate was never really about what killed him. It was about which version of the same mistake got the blame. And that's the gesture this whole video has been circling back to. Every time you've shut a window against the cold this winter, plugged in a space heater, or left a gas stove on a little longer than you needed for the warmth, you made the same trade a Roman in an unheated insula made 2,000 years ago. Minus the charcoal, minus the bronze bowl, same math. Seal the room, trust the fire, skip the air. It's not a Roman problem, it's a sealed room problem, and rooms haven't changed as much as we like to think. So, question for you. The next time you shut every window against the cold, are you actually going to check what's sharing the room with you? Or are you just going to trust the fire, the way that room in Dadastana did? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.